The 30th of November 1939. The Karelian Isthmus. The silence of the Finnish forest is absolute. It is a cold, breathless void, a silence so heavy it feels like a physical weight on the land. The temperature is 20 degrees below zero. Pine needles, frozen brittle, crackle under the patrols of Finnish border guards, their breath pluming in white clouds that freeze instantly to their wool collars. They have been staring east for weeks, waiting. They know what is coming. The Soviet Union has been massing its forces, a red shadow stretching over the horizon. At 6:50, the silence does not break. It evaporates. The world tears open in a single deafening roar as thousands of Soviet artillery pieces unleash the largest barrage seen in Europe since the Great War. From the Barents Sea to the Gulf of Finland, the Red Army's overture begins. 1 million shells rain down, not just on the Mannerheim Line's nascent fortifications, but on civilian targets. Bombers of the Soviet Air Force, black crosses against a grey sky, drop their payloads on Helsinki, shattering the illusion that this is a mere border dispute. For the Finnish soldiers dug in along the isthmus, it is a sensory apocalypse. The ground heaves. Trees that have stood for a century are vaporized into wooden splinters. The air, thick with the smell of cordite and pulverized granite, is unbreathable. This was not war as the Finns knew it. It was an avalanche, a force of nature unleashed by a paranoid giant. But the Soviet invasion, born from the dark, secret protocols of the August 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and Joseph Stalin's paranoid obsession with safeguarding Leningrad, was built on a foundation of profound, catastrophic arrogance. This campaign was supposed to be a surgical, 3-week victory parade, a demonstration of Soviet industrial and ideological might that would see the Red Army marching through Helsinki by Stalin's 60th birthday. Instead, it became a global humiliation, a cautionary tale of how industrial power means nothing against a people fighting for their very soul, their Sisu. The Red Army expected a rapid conquest. What they found, lurking in the frozen white wastes, was a resilience personified by men like the quiet farmer turned sniper, Simo Häyhä. This is the story of not just how Finland survived, but why the Soviet Juggernaut, so terrifying on paper, was bled white by a ghost with a rifle and a nation that refused to break. The architect of the Soviet Union's humiliation was, in many ways, the Soviet Union itself. The Red Army of 1939 was a blunted instrument. Stalin's purges of 1937 to 1938 had decapitated its officer corps. 3 of its 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and over 35,000 other officers had been imprisoned, exiled, or shot. They were replaced by political loyalists, men chosen for their ideological purity rather than their tactical competence. The invasion of Poland just months earlier had been a simple affair, a stab in the back of a nation already reeling from the German blitzkrieg. This success bred a fatal hubris. General Kirill Meretskov, commander of the 7th Army tasked with smashing the Mannerheim Line, was a product of this system. His own memoirs, Serving the People, though heavily censored, betray the operational chaos. He was given command only 2 weeks before the invasion and was reliant on intelligence that was criminally optimistic. Meretskov wrote of the profound failures in planning. The terrain was dismissed. The weather was ignored. It was believed the Finns would not fight, or that their government would collapse after the first shot. The political commissars attached to every unit assured the troops they would be greeted as liberators. They were issued summer-weight uniforms, city maps of Helsinki, and almost no winter camouflage. The tanks, the pride of the Soviet industrial machine, were painted in olive drab, making them perfect targets against the snow. They were sent into a theatre where tanks were nearly useless, confined to narrow, unploughed forest roads that would become funnels of death. On the other side of the border, Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, the 72-year-old commander-in-chief of Finland's armed forces, harboured no illusions. He was a realist, a Swedish-speaking aristocrat who had served the Tsar and now found himself the guardian of a young, fragile democracy. He knew he could not win. His strategy was simply to times not lose asterisk. He had to inflict such a disproportionate amount of pain on the Soviet bear that the Kremlin would be forced to reconsider the cost of its conquest. In a public order of the day, Mannerheim laid bare the stakes for his people. We are fighting for our homes, our faith, and our fatherland. This is a hard fate, as we are forced to stand alone against an enemy that is numerically superior, but our cause is just. His Mannerheim line was not a Maginot line, not a concrete and steel behemoth. It was a defence in depth, a series of clever, shallow trenches, concrete bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles designed not to stop the Red Army, but to channel it, to slow it down, and to force it into pre-sighted killing grounds. Its greatest strength was not its concrete, but its commander's understanding of the Finnish landscape. Mannerheim knew the forests, the lakes, and the swamps were his true fortifications. He was arming the land itself. The statistical mismatch was almost comical in its horror. Stalin committed 4 armies, totaling over 450,000 men, more than 2,500 tanks, and 3,000 aircraft. The entire Finnish army, upon mobilization, numbered 330,000 men. Finland possessed 32 tanks in total, most of them obsolete Renaults from the First World War. They had 114 combat aircraft, many of them biplanes. In the critical Karelian Isthmus, the Red Army enjoyed a 4-5-1 advantage in manpower, a 1-0-0-1 advantage in tanks, and an almost infinite advantage in artillery. The world looked on, expecting Finland to be crushed within days. The Soviet plan was simple, a massive, overwhelming frontal assault to break the Mannerheim line, while other armies swung around the north to cut the country in two. It was a plan drawn up on a map, by men who did not understand the land or the people they were about to attack. They did not understand Sisu, that untranslatable Finnish concept of grit, tenacity, and stubborn courage in the face of impossible odds. The Red Army had prepared for a war against a state. They were about to face a war against the winter, against the forest, and against a nation of ghosts. The Red Army conscript who crossed the border on November 30th was, by and large, a tragic figure. He was often a poorly educated young man from Ukraine or the Central Steppes, handed a rifle, a thin greatcoat, and told he was liberating the Finnish proletariat from fascist masters. He was terrified of his commissars, untrained in winter warfare, and utterly unprepared for the alien, hostile environment of the taiga. His greatest skill was obedience. His greatest weakness was his complete lack of initiative. The Finnish reservist who met him was his antithesis. He was a farmer, a lumberjack, a teacher, or a postman. He was often older, tougher, and intimately familiar with the land he was defending because he owned it. He had likely been hunting in these same forests his entire life. He knew how to build a shelter in the snow, how to read the landscape, how to move silently on skis, and, most importantly, how to shoot with lethal accuracy. He was not an automaton in a vast machine. He was a self-reliant, thinking individual. This fundamental difference in human capital was the bedrock of Finland's defence. This defence was built on a concept the Finns themselves find difficult to translate. The word is Sisu. It is often rendered in English as grit or perseverance, but these words are inadequate. Sisu is not just passive endurance, it is an active, stubborn, and almost joyful form of defiance. It is the will to not just survive, but to fight back, to innovate, and to find a way when all rational analysis says no way exists. It is the psychological engine of the Finnish people, a quality forged by centuries of surviving in a harsh, demanding landscape against powerful, aggressive neighbours. During the Winter War, Sisu manifested as a national consensus. We will not be conquered. This was not a slogan, it was an operational directive. This spirit was institutionalized. While the Red Army relied on fear and political indoctrination, The Finnish defence was a total societal effort, perhaps best exemplified by the Lotta Svärd organisation. This was an all-female, unarmed volunteer auxiliary corps, and it was the backbone of Finland's logistical and medical support system. By 1939, it had over 100,000 members, a staggering number for a nation of 3.7 million. These women were not conscripts, they were patriots who ran the air raid warning stations, the field hospitals, the kitchens, and the supply depots. Primary accounts from Lotta members reveal this potent blend of domesticity and iron-willed resistance. Ino Malmberg, a Lotta serving near the front, wrote in her diary of the constant, overwhelming work. "For 3 days, we have not slept. The wounded come in, frozen, covered in blood. We feed them, we warm them, and we send them back to the fight or to the God that gave them. There is no time for tears. Tears freeze." This total mobilization of the populace freed up tens of thousands of able-bodied men for frontline duty. It also meant that the Soviet soldiers were not just fighting the Finnish army, they were fighting the entire Finnish nation. The Lotta's unofficial motto captured the essence of Sisu. "We will not cry, but we will be hard." This hardness was drilled into the male population from a young age. Finland, having won its independence from Russia only 2 decades prior, was keenly aware of the threat from the east. In 1919, it established the Suojeluskunta, or Civil Guard. This was not a standing army, but a nationwide territorial defence organisation, a nation of riflemen. Membership was voluntary, and its focus was on decentralised, small-unit tactics. A Finnish farmer in the Civil Guard spent his weekends not in barracks, but on the ski range, the rifle range, and in the forest, practicing the very skills that would soon be needed for survival. The Civil Guard's training manuals from the 1932nd are a chilling premonition of the Winter War. They eschew grand battlefield manoeuvres and focus instead on marksmanship, skiing, and guerrilla tactics. The emphasis was on precision. Every Finn was taught that a single bullet was a national resource, not to be wasted. This created a culture of marksmanship that was unparalleled. Competitions were a national pastime. Young men like Simo Häyhä were products of this system. Before the war, he was a champion marksman, his farmhouse shelves filled with trophies. When the invasion came, he was not a raw recruit who needed to be taught how to shoot. He was a master of his craft, given a deadly purpose. This pre-war preparation meant that when the Red Army divisions, thousands strong, lumbered down the narrow forest roads, they were not met by a conventional army. They were met by phantoms. They were harassed by small 4-man ski patrols, clad in white snowsuits, who would appear from the forest, unleash a devastating volley of precision fire from Suomi submachine guns, and then vanish back into the trees, leaving a trail of burning trucks and dead officers. This was Finland's ultimate weapon. It was not the Mannerheim Line's concrete. It was the Sisu of the Lotta's boiling soup under aerial bombardment. It was the Civil Guard's deep, ingrained culture of marksmanship. It was the individual soldier's ability to not only survive, but to times thrive, times at 40 degrees below zero, to see the forest not as a prison, but as a sanctuary and an arsenal. The Red Army was a colossus, an industrial hammer. But it was a hammer striking at water. The Finns were fluid, decentralized, and everywhere at once. The Soviet soldier was taught to follow the road. The Finn was taught to command the forest. It was in this forest, specifically in the frozen sector of Kollaa, that one man was about to turn this national spirit into a tactical nightmare for the Red Army. The Kollaa River, in December 1939, was not a river. It was a scar of frozen milk, a winding, snow-covered depression that marked the last desperate line of defence for the Finnish 12th Division. This was Simo Häyhä's hunting ground. The strategic imperative was brutally simple. Kollaa must hold. If the Red Army's 56th Rifle Division broke through here, the entire Finnish line on the Ladoga-Karelia front would collapse. The Finns were outnumbered 10-1. The terrain was a nightmare. A flat, open expanse of snowfields and sparse skeletal forests, shattered by Soviet artillery. It offered almost no natural cover. For the Red Army, it was a killing field. For Simo Häyhä, it was a rifle range. Simo Häyhä was not a character from heroic fiction. He was the opposite. He was a 3-4-year-old farmer from the municipality of Rautjärvi, a quiet, unassuming man who stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall. His neighbours knew him as a skilled hunter and a champion marksman from the civil guard, but he was, by all accounts, modest and laconic. When asked later in life the secret to his marksmanship, he gave a one-word answer: practice. He was not a professional soldier. He was a specialist, a master craftsman, and his craft was killing. He was assigned to the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 34, given a rifle, a white snowsuit, and told to defend his homeland. His superiors, like Lieutenant Viljo Vainikainen, quickly realized Häyhä was something else entirely. He was not just a good shot, he was a methodical, calculating, and patient predator. His actions were not feats of impulse, but cold, deliberate applications of a lifetime of skill. His battlefield preparation was a ritual of meticulous detail, a process that transformed him from a farmer into the Belaya Smert, the White Death. First was his camouflage. He was clad in a thick, multi-layered white snow anorak and trousers, which not only concealed him, but also padded his body against the excruciating cold and the hard-packed snow. He carried no glinting equipment. Even his rifle was chosen for its lack of reflection. Unlike the Soviet snipers, who were being deployed with new, telescopic-sighted rifles, Häyhä rejected the scope. He knew, from his experience as a hunter, that a scope was a liability. It could fog over in the sub-zero temperatures. It could catch the low winter sun and glint, betraying his position, and it forced the shooter to raise his head higher, presenting a larger target. Instead, he used the standard-issue Finnish Mosin-Nagant M, divided by 28-30, a rifle he knew intimately and relied on its simple, rugged iron sights. This was his most defining characteristic. To achieve what he did with iron sights is, to the modern marksman, almost supernatural. It required a perfect understanding of light, wind, and distance. His process of building a hide was just as precise. He would crawl out into the no-man's land before dawn, often alone, and select his position. He would not just lie on the snow, he would sculpt it. He would use his gloved hands to pack the snow in front of his rifle's muzzle into a hard, dense bank. This served 2 purposes. It acted as a perfect, stable rest for his rifle, and, more importantly, it completely muffled the muzzle blast. A rifle shot in the flat, frozen expanse of Kollaa would echo for miles. Häyhä's shot would be a dull phut, a whisper, the cloud of snow kicked up by the muzzle, which betrayed so many other snipers, was completely contained. Perhaps his most famous technique was the simplest. His commanding officer, Captain Antti Rantamaa, recorded this detail in his logs, amazed at his sniper's professionalism. Häyhä would fill his mouth with snow and keep it there, letting it slowly melt. He did this to prevent his own breath, the slightest, foggiest plume in the sub-zero air, from rising from his position and giving him away. He would lie there, perfectly still, for hours, his body temperature dropping to the level of the snow around him, becoming just another drift in the white landscape. From this position he began his work. The Red Army soldiers of the 56th Division learned to fear the forest. They would advance in their olive-drab greatcoats, huddling together for warmth and courage, making them perfect targets. Then the whispers would begin. A commissar would suddenly drop, a hole appearing in his forehead. A machine gunner would slump over his weapon. A soldier, running for cover, would fall without a sound. There was no crack of a rifle, no muzzle flash, just the quiet, methodical elimination of their leaders and their specialists. Finnish accounts from captured Soviet prisoners spoke of the paralyzing terror. The men called the unseen force the Belaya Smert. They believed he was a phantom, a spirit of the forest. They were told it was just one man. This only increased the psychological trauma. How could one man, with one rifle, hold back an entire division. Simo Häyhä's daily routine was grimly recorded. He would go out before dawn with his rifle and a day's supply of dried bread and sugar lumps. He would return after dusk. Captain Rantamar, his company commander, would ask him his tally. Häyhä would report, without emotion, a number. On one day, December 21st, 1939, his tally was 25, his personal best. This was not an anomaly. This was the system. Simo Häyhä was the ultimate, lethal expression of the Sisu and the civil guard training. He was the decentralized, self-reliant, expert warrior that Finland had cultivated for this exact moment. He had taken the abstract concept of Finnish defiance and turned it into a grim, daily ledger of death. The ghost of Kollaa was real, and he was single-handedly demoralizing an entire flank of the Red Army. For the men of the Soviet 56th Rifle Division, the Kollaa front was not a battlefield, it was a purgatory. The cold was a living enemy, a constant, gnawing presence that infiltrated their shoddy greatcoats and froze their boot grease solid. But the cold was predictable. The real enemy was the silence. A Red Army patrol, 10 men strong, moves through a stand of shattered birches, their felt boots crunching in the packed snow. They are paranoid, their eyes scanning the endless, undulating white. They have been told to watch for glints of light, for muzzle flashes, for the dark shape of a man. They see nothing. There is only the wind, the snow, and the low grey sky. The patrol leader, a junior lieutenant, feels a moment of false security. They are half a kilometre from their own lines. Surely no Finn would be this deep, this exposed. He turns to urge his men forward. The sound is not a crack, it is a whisper, a dull thwump that is instantly swallowed by the snow. The lieutenant's head snaps back, a red-black hole appearing in his thick fur hat. He falls without a sound, his body a rigid, awkward shape before he even hits the ground. The patrol freezes. They drop to their bellies, rifles pointed at nothing. Where did it come from? There was no flash, no smoke, no sound. 10 seconds later, as the political commissar begins to shout orders, the thwump comes again. The commissar slumps, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The remaining 8 men panic. They break and run, scrambling back the way they came, leaving their officers dead in the snow. They have just been ambushed, engaged, and broken by a single man. This was the anatomy of Simo Häyhä's war. It was not a battle, it was a hunt. And the Red Army's response to this phantom was a case study in tactical desperation. First, they tried to fight fire with fire. The Soviet High Command, incensed by the reports of a single sniper paralyzing their troop movements, deployed their own specialists. These were not conscripts. They were dedicated counter-sniper teams, often graduates of the Osawaviakim marksmanship programs, armed with the best equipment the Red Army had. The Mosin-Nagant 91/30, fitted with the 3.5 X-Power PE or PEM telescopic sight. On paper, the Soviet sniper had every advantage. His scope allowed for positive identification and precise aim at distances Häyhä could only dream of. But in the frozen hell of Kollaa, their equipment was a death warrant. Finnish after-action reports and interviews with Häyhä himself reveal the fatal flaw in the Soviet doctrine. A telescopic sight, in the low winter sun, is a mirror. The Soviet snipers, trained in a conventional European setting, would scan the horizon, and the glass of their optics would catch the light, sending a tiny, star-like flash across the snow. For Häyhä, scanning the field with his bare eyes, this glint was a bullseye. He did not need to find the man, he only needed to find the flash. Using his iron sights, he would aim just below the glint, wait, and squeeze the trigger. The man who relied on technology was killed by the man who relied on his senses. When the counter-snipers failed, or were themselves killed, the Red Army's response became industrial. If precision could not kill the White Death, perhaps brute force could. This is when the artillery was called in. Finnish accounts from Infantry Regiment 34 are filled with a kind of bewildered awe at the sheer, wasteful terror of the Soviet response. If a single shot was fired from a copse of trees, the Finns knew what was coming. The Soviet observers would direct their batteries, and within minutes, the entire area, an area where Häyhä was times suspected, times to be, would be systematically annihilated by mortar fire and heavy artillery. The Finns called this grave service. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of high-explosive shells would be used to plough a 50-square-metre patch of forest into black, splintered mulch. The ground would heave, the air would fill with shrapnel, and the snow would be vaporized. The Soviets were not just trying to kill a man, they were trying to excavate him from the landscape. But Häyhä was not there. He was a ghost. He understood the rhythm of their fear. He would fire, and he would move. He would crawl, on his belly, for 200 meters, build a new hide, and wait. The artillery would pound his old position, and while the shells were still falling, he would send another whisper from his rifle, from a new direction, starting the cycle of paranoia all over again. But the most potent and often misunderstood aspect of Häyhä's lethality was his versatility. He was not simply a static sniper, a man who lay in the snow for 8 hours. He was a complete guerrilla warrior. His official, confirmed sniper kill count is 505. But there is a second number, a tally that is often overlooked, but is perhaps even more terrifying. Over 200 kills with the Suomi KP divided by -31 submachine gun. The Suomi KP divided by -31 was a Finnish masterpiece of engineering, a 9mm submachine gun with a 71-round drum magazine. It was accurate, reliable in the extreme cold, and had a high rate of fire. In Häyhä's hands, it was a weapon of pure chaos. When the Red Army patrols grew too cautious to be picked off at a distance, Häyhä would change his tactics. He would strap on his skis, take his Suomi, and hunt them in the close-quarters darkness of the forest. He would wait, clad in his white anorak, until a patrol was skiing down a narrow path, and then he would rise from the snowbank beside them, unleashing the entire 71-round drum. It was a close-quarters massacre. This was the other White Death. Häyhä's ambushes were more than just a military tactic. They were a form of psychological warfare that achieved strategic goals. Every round he fired inflicted a cost wildly disproportionate to its size. A single bullet from his M divided by 28 to 30 not only killed a man but also pinned down a platoon, forced a company to dig in, and demanded an artillery barrage in response. A single drum from his Suomi could shatter the morale of an entire regiment. Simo Häyhä, the quiet farmer, was not just fighting a war of attrition. He was conducting a war of psychological and industrial times, subversion asterisk, forcing the Red Army to expend thousands of shells, waste thousands of man-hours, and sacrifice the sanity of its soldiers, all to counter the ghost in the snow. The greatest single irony of the Winter War, the central mechanical fact of Simo Häyhä's legendary tally, is that both he and the men he hunted used the exact same rifle, the Mosin-Nagant. This was not a war of technological disparity in the conventional sense, not a case of laser-guided munitions versus cavalry. It was something far more subtle and profound. It was a war of philosophies, a clash between two opposing theories of industrial design and human value, both embodied in a 7.62mm bolt-action rifle. The Red Army, the industrial colossus, wielded the Mosin-Nagant 1891/30 as a club, a mass-produced tool for a mass-produced army. The Finns, and Simo Häyhä specifically, wielded the M divided by 28 to 30 Pistikova as a scalpel. Häyhä's rifle, the M divided by 28 to 30, was technically a Mosin-Nagant, but only in the way a Formula One car is technically a family sedan. It was a product of the Finnish Suojeluskunta, or Civil Guard, which had a national obsession with marksmanship. The Finns had captured tens of thousands of Russian M1891 rifles during their 1918 Civil War. They didn't just refurbish them, they systematically re-engineered them. The M divided by 28-30 was built on a captured Russian receiver, but almost every other component was a Finnish improvement. The most critical component was the barrel. Häyhä's rifle had a new, heavy-profile, free-floated barrel manufactured by Seiko, Suojeluskuntain Ace, ja Konepaja Oi. These barrels were made to a match-grade standard that the vast Soviet factories, churning out rifles by the million, could not or would not replicate. Finnish armourers' logs from the 1932 show an obsession with precision, with many M divided by 28-30 being glass-bedded, a technique where the action is seated in the stock on a bed of resin, eliminating tiny imperfections and ensuring perfect, consistent contact. This was a craftsman's rifle. Furthermore, the Finns redesigned the trigger, giving it a crisp two-stage pull instead of the notoriously long, mushy pull of the Russian 91/30. But Häyhä's true advantage, the secret to his rejection of the telescopic sight, lay in his iron sights. The Finnish M divided by 28-30 used a refined tangent rear sight, meticulously calibrated for the new, heavier D166 Finnish-made cartridge. The front sight was a sharp, protected barleycorn. This setup was fast, rugged, and, in the hands of a master, capable of astonishing precision. It was a system designed by marksmen, for marksmen. It was a rifle built on the philosophical assumption that the individual soldier was a skilled, valuable asset whose accuracy was worth investing in. The Red Army's standard-issue Model 1891/30 was the physical manifestation of the exact opposite philosophy. It was a product of Stalin's forced industrialization, built on the doctrine of kolичество, or quantity. The goal was not to make one perfect rifle, but to make 20 million adequate ones. Soviet production statistics from 1939 are staggering, but the quality control was often abysmal. After-action reports from the Winter War are filled with accounts of rifles with poor barrel tolerances, sticky bolts, and crude minute of man accuracy. The rifle was not a tool of precision, it was a tool of mass fire. This flawed philosophy became a fatal liability in their sniper program. The Red Army, unlike the Finns, had embraced the telescopic sight. Their sniper variant 91 divided by 30 were fitted with PE or PEM scopes. On a firing range in sunny Ukraine, they were effective. In the frozen, low-light, sub-zero conditions of Karelia, they were a disaster. Finnish reports and veteran interviews are unanimous on this. The steel-bodied scopes, mounted high on the rifle, were prone to fogging on the inside. The lubricant on their adjustment knobs would freeze solid. The glass, as Häyhä knew, was a mirror, catching the low winter sun and giving away the sniper's position. But worst of all, the high-mounted scope forced the Soviet sniper to lift his head several inches higher above his cover to see through it. He was a perfect, head-shaped target, and Simo Häyhä, with his low-profile iron sights, was there to hunt him. This clash of industrial philosophies extended far beyond the rifle. The Red Army's industrial hammer was supposed to be its tank corps. On paper, the 2,500 tanks they deployed were an undefeatable armada. They were primarily T-26 seconds and the fast BT-7 Christie tanks. But again, these were machines designed with a critical, philosophical flaw. They were built for mass, not for resilience. Finnish anti-tank reports from the Mannerheim line are almost comical in their dismissal of this armour. The T-26's armour, barely 15 millimeters thick, was riveted together. This was a critical error. When a Finnish 37mm Bofors anti-tank round struck the hull, even if it didn't penetrate the shock, would shear the rivets on the inside, sending them flying around the crew compartment like red-hot shrapnel, a phenomenon known as spalling. The Finns discovered that the T-26's engine ventilation, located on the rear deck, was a massive, unprotected vulnerability. The Finns, who had almost no anti-tank guns, were forced to innovate, to apply the Sisu philosophy to armoured warfare. This gave birth to the weapon that would become a global icon, the Molotov Cocktail. This was not just a bottle of gasoline. It was a specific, refined weapon system. It was a glass bottle filled with a tar-like mixture of gasoline, potassium chlorate, and kerosene. A storm-proof match was strapped to the side. When thrown against the T-26's engine grate, the burning mixture would be sucked directly into the engine compartment, instantly igniting the machine. The tool is only as good as the doctrine, and the doctrine is only as good as the man. Finland's M/28-30 rifle was a tool of precision, wielded by a man trained in precision. The Soviet 91/30 was a tool of mass, wielded by a conscript trained in obedience. The Soviet T-26 was a tool of industrial might, but its blueprints contained the seeds of its own destruction, a flaw that could be exploited by a single, brave Finn with a glass bottle. The Red Army had brought an industrial hammer to a surgical fight, and the White Death was the surgeon. There is a Finnish word, Motti. In its original peacetime context, it is an innocuous forestry term. It means a cubic meter of firewood, timber that has been felled, cut into manageable lengths, stacked by the side of a forest road, and left to be collected. It is a word of order, industry, and preparation. In the winter of 1939, Finnish soldiers gave this mundane word a new, terrifying military definition. The Red Army, stuck in columns that stretched for miles down the narrow, snow-choked forest roads, was the timber. The Finnish ski troops, appearing like phantoms from the trees, were the lumberjacks. They would cut the road, isolate a division from its supply line, and then, at their leisure, they would chop that division into smaller, isolated, digestible mottes of men and armour. These blocks of the Red Army, cut off and surrounded, were then left to be collected, not by trucks, but by General Winter and the relentless Finnish patrols. This was the Motti tactic, and it was Finland's art of war. It was not a conventional strategy of annihilation, it was a strategy of systemic, biological disintegration. It was a form of asymmetric warfare, so perfectly suited to the terrain and the national character, that it turned the Red Army's greatest strengths, its overwhelming numbers, and its mechanized might into its most fatal liabilities. The tactic was a brutal, three-step process, born from Finnish field manuals that prioritized flexibility and small unit initiative. First, the Finns would not engage the head of the Soviet column. Instead, they would let the first, heavily armoured elements advance deep into the forest, stretching their supply lines thin, like a rubber band. The first strike would be sudden and decisive. A Finnish ski patrol would emerge from the woods and cut the road times behind, times the lead elements, destroying a few key trucks or tanks to create a permanent roadblock. The column was now pinned. Second, a larger force would attack the rear of the column, cutting it off from its main supply depots. The entire Soviet division, or in some cases, an entire corps, was now trapped. It was a long, thin serpent, 10 to 20 kilometers long, with no head and no tail. It was at this moment that the third, most gruesome phase began. The Finns would not launch a frontal assault against the trapped, encircled column. That would be suicide. Instead, they would send their ski troops, the ghost brigades, into the forest to move parallel to the road. They would then attack the column from its weakest point, its thin, unprotected flanks. They would cut the column into smaller, isolated pockets, the mottis. The most devastating and famous example of this tactic was the Battle of Suomussalmi, which took place in the frozen, desolate north in December 1939 and January 1940. Here, the Soviet 163rd Division and the elite 44th Kiev Rifle Division were ordered to march down a single road to cut Finland in half. They were met by the Finnish 9th Division, commanded by the brilliant and ruthless Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo. Siilasvuo had 11,000 men. The Soviets had over 45,000. Siilasvuo's men were local reservists on skis, armed with rifles and submachine guns. The Soviet 44th Division was a fully mechanized unit, with over 100 tanks and thousands of trucks. Häyhä executed the Motti tactic to perfection. He first cut the right road, trapping the 163rd Division around the town of Suomussalmi. He then turned his attention to the 44th Division, which was lumbering to the rescue. He chopped their column into a dozen distinct mottis along the narrow road. Then, he simply waited. This is where General Winter became Finland's most powerful ally. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The men of the 44th Division, many of them Ukrainians who had never seen snow, were trapped in their vehicles. They were in summer-weight uniforms. Their diesel engines froze solid. Their tanks, which they had believed were their invincible armour, became their steel tombs. The Finns, meanwhile, were at home. They had field kitchens, tents with stoves, and warm winter clothing. They would set up field hospitals and saunas just kilometres from the starving, freezing Mottis. Primary evidence from captured Soviet prisoners tells a story of complete societal collapse. Discipline evaporated. Officers were shot by their own men. Soldiers, mad with hunger, slaughtered their pack animals, then their horses. When the horses were gone, they boiled their leather belts and boots. The Finns, listening on field radios, could hear the Soviet broadcasts descending into panic, then silence. The Soviet report on the destruction of the 44th Division, a document that later led to the execution of its commander, General Vinogradov, and his commissars, is a stark admission of the tactic's success. It reads, "The units, having been cut off from each other, had no combat cohesion. Command and control was completely lost. The enemy, in small, fast-moving ski groups, was everywhere and nowhere." After 2 weeks of this, when the Mottis were weakened by starvation, frostbite, and despair, Colonel Häyhä gave the order to attack. The Finnish ski troops, with their Suomi submachine guns, moved in. It was not a battle, it was a series of small, brutal executions. They overran the Mottis one by one, killing the exhausted, frozen survivors. The final haul from the Raate road was staggering. The Finns had destroyed 2 entire Soviet divisions, captured 85 tanks, 437 trucks, 27 artillery pieces, and killed over 23,000 Red Army soldiers. The 9th Division lost 800 men. The Motti tactic was the physical application of Sisu. It was an intellectual, creative, and audacious response to an existential threat. It recognized that the Red Army's entire doctrine was centralized, inflexible, and completely dependent on its roads. The Finns turned this doctrine against itself. They used their enemy's own linear, predictable movement to trap it, and then used the forest, their home, as the walls of the prison. The Motti tactic proved that in the right terrain, against the right enemy, 11,000 men who knew the land could defeat 45,000 who were merely passing through. For the Finnish infantrymen crouching in a snow-filled ditch along the Mannerheim line, this was the sound of industrial death. It was the squeal of ungreased bogie wheels, the clatter of steel tracks on frozen earth, and the low, guttural roar of a T-26 tank's diesel engine. The ground vibrated. The smell of its exhaust, a foul, oily plume, washed over the trench. Through the shattered trees, the T-26 lumbered forward, its olive-drab armour seeming invulnerable, its 45mm cannon sniffing for targets. To the men in its path, armed only with rifles, it was a steel behemoth from a more advanced, more brutal age. And then, from a foxhole just 10 metres away, a lone Finnish soldier would rise up. He would not fire a rifle, he would not launch a rocket, he would pull his arm back and hurl a single glass bottle, trailing a comet of fire. This was the birth of the Molotov Cocktail, a weapon so simple, so desperate, and so shockingly effective that it became the defining symbol of the people's improvised war. Its name was, in itself, an act of supreme Finnish Sisu, an acidic piece of gallows humour propaganda. When the Soviet Union began its air raids on Helsinki, the bombers dropped massive RAB-3 cluster munitions, which scattered hundreds of small incendiary bomblets. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, in cynical, brazen diplomatic broadcasts, denit bombing civilians. He claimed, infamously, that the aircraft were merely dropping humanitarian breadbaskets to the starving Finnish people. The Finns, listening to this absurdity on their radios as their capital burned, developed a national, unified and bitter sense of humour. They quickly dubbed the Soviet cluster bombs Molotov's breadbaskets. And in response, the Finnish soldiers, who were just beginning to experiment with firebombs against Soviet tanks, created the perfect accompaniment. This, they said, was the Molotov Cocktail, a drink to go with the food. But what the Red Army faced was not just a random gasoline bomb thrown by a farmer. It was a sophisticated, rapidly industrialized and chemically engineered weapon system, mass-produced by the Finnish state. The Finnish High Command, realizing their desperate lack of anti-tank guns, had tasked the Alko Corporation, Finland's state liquor monopoly, with creating and mass-producing an optimized incendiary. Alko's engineers and chemists went to work. The Molotov cocktail that entered mass production was a specific, refined formula. It was a 750 milliliter glass bottle filled not just with gasoline, but with a viscous, tar-like mixture of potassium chlorate, kerosene, and gasoline. This formula was a work of chemical genius. The tar made the mixture incredibly sticky, ensuring it would cling to the vertical armor of a tank instead of just splashing off. The kerosene provided a long, stable burn time. The potassium chlorate acted as an oxidizer, making the fire hotter and nearly impossible to extinguish. Each bottle was bundled with 2 long, storm-proof pyrotechnic matches, which would burn reliably even in the wind and snow. The Alko factory at Rajamäki, which normally produced vodka, was converted into a weapons arsenal, churning out 540,000 of these cocktails during the war's 105 days. This industrial-scale improvisation was useless, however, without the tactics and the almost suicidal bravery required to deploy it. This was the realm of the Finnish anti-tank hunter-killer teams. Finnish infantry manuals from the period are terrifying in their cold, practical assessment of the courage required. The T-26's riveted 15mm armour was vulnerable, but most times, vulnerable point was the engine's air intake and exhaust vent, located on the rear deck. To hit this spot, a soldier could not throw the bottle from 30 meters away. He had to hit a target the size of a dinner plate, on a moving vehicle, from almost point-blank range. The tactics they developed were a pure expression of Sisu. The close-in killers would dig narrow, one-man foxholes, times directly in the path, times of the advancing tanks. They were ordered to let the 10-ton steel machine clank and rumble times over their position asterisk. As the tank passed, the soldier, crouching in his hole as the steel monster scraped over his head, would have a few seconds. He would ignite the matches, rise up times behind times the tank, and hurl his bottle directly onto the rear engine deck. The flaming, sticky mixture would be instantly sucked through the ventilation grate and into the engine compartment, flooding the crew cabin with fire and smoke and igniting the diesel fuel. This was not the only tactic. Other improvised weapons were used in concert. Soldiers would use simple steel crowbars, running alongside a tank in a suicidal charge, to try and jam the bar between the T-26's bogie wheels and suspension, throwing a track. Others carried panzerimiina or kasapanos, a satchel charge made of 3 to 6 kilograms of TNT, which they would have to physically place on the tank's hull or slide under its belly. Memoirs from veterans of the Mannerheim line are filled with these visceral, terrifying accounts. They speak of the smell, the noise, the feeling of being hunted, and the incredible, focused courage it took to stand one's ground. The Molotov cocktail was the perfect weapon for the Winter War. It was the equalizer. It was the physical proof that a mass-produced industrial monster could be defeated by an individual's courage, a chemist's ingenuity, and a nation's unbreakable will. It was decentralized, cheap, and effective. The Red Army had thousands of tanks. Finland had hundreds of thousands of bottles and a populace with the Sisu to use them. It was the people's war, bottled and set aflame. Night was the enemy. For the Red Army soldier, huddling in a frozen, shallow trench on the Kollaa front. The sun setting was not a relief. It was the beginning of the true terror. The cold deepened, sinking its teeth into his bones, but the cold was not what he feared. He feared the sounds. The forest, which was a silent, empty void by day, came alive at night. It was the crack of a branch far off in the darkness. Was it an animal or a Finnish ski patrol? It was the sudden, sharp cry of a cuckoo bird. He had heard the stories. The conscript from Leningrad next to him had been shot by a cuckoo. The Finns, masters of the woods, would climb trees and use the bird's call to signal targets, to coordinate their ambushes. The cuckoo would call, and a moment later, a man would die, a dull thwomp from the darkness. Soon, the soldiers began to hear cuckoos everywhere, even when there were none. They were being hunted by a forest that had allied itself with their enemy. This was the true, crippling cost of the winter war for the Red Army. It was not just a war of attrition, it was a war of psychological annihilation. Finland's greatest successes were not just in the high kill counts, but in the systemic destruction of the Red Army's morale. The Belaya Smert was the centerpiece of this campaign. The damage Simo Häyhä inflicted was not just the 505 men he killed. It was the terror he sowed in the 50,000 men who knew times he was out there. Finnish intelligence reports, compiled from the interrogations of Soviet prisoners of war, paint a vivid picture of this sniper phobia. Captured soldiers were not just defeated, they were broken. They spoke in hushed, terrified tones about the White Death. They did not believe he was a man. They believed he was a phantom, a spirit of the forest summoned by the Finns to protect their land. They told stories of men being shot from impossible distances, of patrols where every man was shot in the exact same spot, of a ghost who could not be seen, heard, or killed. This legend became a weapon more powerful than Häyhä's rifle. It caused a complete breakdown in Red Army unit cohesion. Officers were the first to be targeted, and soon, junior lieutenants and commissars refused to lead their men on patrols. They would stay in their bunkers, claiming illness. Soldiers refused to advance, openly defying orders. Why walk out into the open snowfield to be executed by a ghost? The Soviet response, indiscriminate artillery barrages, only worsened the terror. It proved to the soldiers that their commanders were also afraid, that they had no answer to the phantom except to waste thousands of shells on an empty forest. This psychological collapse was perfected in the Mottis. The Battle of Suomussalmi was not just a tactical masterpiece. It was a clinical, weeks-long experiment in driving an army insane. The diaries of Soviet soldiers recovered from the frozen pockets of the 44th Division are among the most harrowing documents of the war. They do not speak of battles, but of a descent into a frozen hell. The diary of a Soviet medical officer, found on his frozen body, recorded the psychological toll. He wrote not of wounds, but of frostbite of the mind. He described men who would simply sit in the snow, staring, refusing to eat or speak, until they froze solid. He wrote of rampant paranoia. The Finns, just out of sight, would use loudspeakers to broadcast in broken Russian. "Comrades, your commissars are lying to you. They are warm in their bunkers. You are freezing. Come to us. We have food." Men, already starving, would turn on each other, accusing their comrades of hoarding a crust of bread. Discipline vanished. Soldiers shot their own officers to get their boots or their coats. They huddled in their tanks, which had become steel coffins, their diesel frozen, and slowly went mad from the hunger and the cold. This was the Motti mindset, a complete, systemic collapse of the human psyche. This was not all by chance. Finland waged a smart, deliberate psychological war. The Finnish army's propagandatoimisto, propaganda office, worked hand in glove with the field commanders. They understood the mind of the Soviet conscript. They knew he was poorly educated, motivated by fear, and lied to by his commissars. So, the Finnish propaganda leaflets, dropped by the thousands over the Mottis and the front lines, were not simple insults. They were psychologically devastating. They were truth bombs. Some leaflets were simple. safe passage guarantees, promising food and warmth to any soldier who deserted. Others were more insidious. They would print maps showing the Finnish encirclements, visually proving to the trapped soldiers that their situation was hopeless. The most effective leaflets were those that undermined the commissars. They would read, "Red Army soldier, your commissar told you the Finns would welcome you. Why are they shooting? Your commissar told you this war would be over in a week. Why have you been freezing for a month? Your commissar is a liar. He is safe. You are going to die." For the soldier who was already starving, freezing, and being haunted by phantom snipers, this propaganda was not a lie. It was the simple, terrifying truth. The Red Army's nightmare was not just the cold, or the Motti, or the Molotov cocktail. It was the realization that their entire worldview was a lie. They were not liberators. They were invaders. They were not invincible. They were being systematically humiliated by a nation of farmers. Finland, led by the tactical genius of its commanders and the lethal spectre of men like Simo Häyhä, had successfully waged a war on the Red Army's collective mind. It had broken their will, shattered their sanity, and turned their industrial hammer into a cowering, shell-shocked wreck. The 6th of March 1940. The Kollaa front was no longer a hunting ground. It was an inferno. The Red Army of March was not the disorganized, freezing mob of December. The Kremlin, humiliated and furious, had learned its lessons. Stalin had replaced his incompetent commanders. General Semyon Timoshenko had taken over, and he was a proponent of one thing: overwhelming, brutal, and coordinated force. The new Soviet doctrine was simple: systematic, industrial annihilation. For weeks, the Kollaa front had ceased to be a sniper's duel. It was now a meat grinder, a relentless 2-4-hour-a-day barrage of massed artillery, heavy mortars, and aerial bombardment, followed by human wave assaults. Simo Häyhä was still there. He was no longer the invisible ghost, the lone predator. He was now a frontline soldier, a corporal in a company that was desperately trying to hold a line that was evaporating under a rain of steel. He had survived for 100 days. He had survived counter-snipers, artillery barrages, and the sheer, grinding exhaustion. He was a living legend, the White Death, the unkillable symbol of Sisu. But on March 6th, just 7 days before the end of the war, his luck and the laws of probability finally ran out. The long-held myth, the one that completes the romantic narrative, is that he was finally hit by a rival Soviet sniper, a master calling out the master. The reality, as recorded by his comrades in Infantry Regiment 34, is far more brutal, random, and in line with the new, impersonal nature of the war. It was not a sniper's bullet. It was an explosive, fragmenting round. Whether it was a mortar shell, a shrapnel fragment from an artillery burst, or, as some accounts suggest, an explosive flechette round fired from a short distance during a chaotic counter-assault, the result was the same. The projectile struck him on the left side of his face. The impact was catastrophic. It did not just wound him, it detonated. The high-velocity, fragmenting round shattered his left jaw, tore away most of his left cheek, and obliterated the soft and hard tissue of his lower face. It was an injury that, under any normal circumstances, should have been instantly fatal. The sheer shock and blood loss should have killed him in seconds. His fellow soldiers, stumbling upon his position, found him in the snow. The man who saw him first, and who helped carry him back, gave the famous, horrifying description that would echo through the Finnish lines. Half his face was missing. He was unrecognizable. His white snowsuit was stained black-red. He was, by all appearances, dead. His company commander, Captain Antti Rantamaa, had already been tallying his kills on a separate Simo Häyhä list, as if he were a separate entity. Now, it seemed, the legend had finally fallen. He was bundled onto a stretcher, a tag put on him that marked him as KIA, killed in action. He was just one more body in a day that had seen hundreds. But Simo Häyhä was not dead. The same impossible, stubborn Sisu that had kept him alive for hours in a snowbank at 40 below zero was now, unconsciously, fighting to keep his own body alive. On the sleigh, piled with other dead and wounded being pulled back to the field hospital, a soldier noticed a leg twitch. He was alive. He was evacuated, a comatose, horrifically wounded soldier, and began a long, agonizing journey through the field hospitals. He slipped into a deep coma that would last for a week. The news of his wounding spread, and it was a devastating blow to the morale of the men at Kollaa. If the White M death could fall, what hope was there for any of them? This was the cost of his legendary status. The ghost was, after all, a man. The wound he sustained was not a clean, heroic Hollywood injury. It was a disfiguring, life-altering trauma. When he finally awoke from his coma on the 13th of March 1940, it was to the sound of church bells. He thought, in his delirium, that they were ringing for an air raid. A nurse told him no. They were ringing for peace. The Winter War was over. The Moscow Peace Treaty had been signed. Simo Häyhä had survived, but his face was permanently shattered. The war had taken a quiet farmer and turned him into a global legend, a phantom who had humiliated an empire. But in its final, random act of violence, the war had also ensured that the man would forever carry the physical, unglamorous, and agonizing price of the Sisu he had come to symbolize. His shattered jaw was a permanent testament to the fact that there are no unkillable men, only men with an unkillable will. The bells that rang in Helsinki on the 13th of March 1940 were for a bitter peace. In the grim, silent halls of the Kremlin, there were no bells. There was no celebration. Stalin had won. The Moscow Peace Treaty granted the Soviet Union the Karelian Isthmus, the city of Viborg, and a naval base at Hanko, 11% of Finland's territory. On paper, the strategic objective of protecting Leningrad had been achieved. But the mood in Moscow was not one of triumph. It was one of cold, murderous, and deeply humiliated fury. The victory parade that had been planned for Stalin's 60th birthday in December had been a fantasy. The 3-week war had turned into a 105-day catastrophe, and now the Kremlin had to count the cost. The statistical nightmare, when the final reports were compiled, was so horrific that the numbers were immediately classified as a state secret. They would remain hidden in Soviet archives for half a century. The official, sanitized figures released in 1940 were a laughable fiction. It was only after the fall of the Soviet Union that historians like Grigory Krivosheyev, granted access to the declassified archives, could finally publish the true cost. The numbers are staggering. The Red Army, in 105 days, suffered 126,875 men killed or missing. A further 264,908 were wounded, hospitalized, or severely frostbitten. The total, irreversible loss of manpower was nearly 400,000 men. The material cost was just as catastrophic. Over 2,200 Soviet tanks were confirmed, destroyed or captured, an armada of armor, completely annihilated. Over 700 aircraft had been shot down. Finland, a nation of 3.7 million people, had lost 25,904 killed and 43,557 wounded. The numbers themselves are horrific, but it is the times ratio times that reveals the true scale of the humiliation. For every one Finnish soldier killed, the Red Army lost 5. For every one Finnish tank lost, the Red Army lost 60. The Soviet Union had thrown a force of nearly 1 million men, 3,000 tanks, and 3,000 aircraft at a nation with 32 tanks and 114 aircraft, and had been fought to a bloody, catastrophic standstill. This was not a victory. It was the most lopsided and shameful military performance of the 20th century. Stalin, a man who believed in results and not excuses, began the hunt for scapegoats. The blame could not possibly lie with the system, or with the purges that had hollowed out the officer corps, or with his own paranoid, flawed strategy. The blame had to lie with individuals. The most famous and brutal example was the fate of the 44th Kiev Rifle Division, the elite unit that had been systematically destroyed at Suomussalmi. Its commander, General Alexei Vinogradov, and his senior officers, who had managed to escape the Motti, were immediately arrested by the NKVD, the secret police. They were given a show trial. They were accused of cowardice and losing the confidence of the workers. Nikita Khrushchev, who was a senior political figure at the time, noted in his memoirs the cold, pragmatic cruelty of the affair. He wrote that the men were not executed because they were guilty, but because their failure had to be paid for. On the 11th of January 1940, Vinogradov, his chief of staff, and his political commissar were taken outside and summarily shot. Their execution was a message to every other commander in the Red Army: win or die. This internal bloodletting did nothing to stanch the external humiliation. The entire world had been watching. The League of Nations, in its last meaningful act, had expelled the Soviet Union. But more importantly, the intelligence services in Berlin had been observing this display of military incompetence with a rapt and growing sense of confidence. For years, Adolf Hitler and his high command had harbored a grudging respect for the sheer size and supposed industrial might of the Red Army. The Winter War shattered that illusion. German military attachés in Finland and spies on the front sent back reports that were almost giddy with their contempt for Soviet tactics. They saw an army with no coordination between its air and ground forces. They saw tanks that were poorly built and poorly deployed. They saw an officer corps terrified of initiative and a rank and file that was poorly trained and unmotivated. The Red Army was not a modern, terrifying juggernaut. It was a clumsy, headless giant, a colossus on feet of clay. This was the true, catastrophic legacy of the Winter War for the Soviet Union. The victory was its single greatest defeat. It had won a few square kilometers of frozen, worthless territory, but in doing so, it had exposed every single one of its weaknesses to the entire world. It had paid for that land with the blood of 126,000 of its sons and the complete destruction of its international reputation. And, most fatally, it had given its most dangerous and ambitious enemy, who was at that very moment planning his conquest of Europe, a precise and encouraging blueprint for his future invasion, Operation Barbarossa. The scene in the Kremlin on the night of the 12th of March 1940 was one of grim, exhausted finality. There was no joy, no celebration of a great victory. The Finnish delegation, led by Prime Minister Risto Ryti, sat in stunned, funereal silence. They had come not to negotiate, but to receive terms. Vyacheslav Molotov, the architect of the war's cynical diplomacy, read the demands. Finland was to cede the entire Karelian isthmus, including its second-largest city, Vyborg, the historical and industrial heart of the nation. They were to cede vast territories north of Lake Ladoga. They would lease the Hanko Peninsula to the Soviets as a naval base, a dagger pointed at Helsinki. In total, 11% of Finland's territory, accounting for 30% of its economic output, was to be signed away. The Finns were given less than 24 hours. They signed. The bitter peace had begun. This was Stalin's Pyrrhic victory. He had won a map. But the true cost, the human cost, was immediately and devastatingly apparent. The ceded territories were home to 420,000 Finnish citizens, 12% of the nation's entire population. According to the treaty, they were allowed to remain in their homes as Soviet citizens. What happened next was perhaps the most powerful act of Sisu in the entire war, a stunning, final rebuke of Molotov's claim of liberation. Given the choice to stay or leave, the Finns chose to leave. All of them. In a mass, voluntary and heartbreaking exodus, 420,000 people abandoned everything they owned. Primary accounts from the Karelian evacuation are a testament to this profound national tragedy. Farmers, given only days to depart, were seen leading their cattle to the new, arbitrary border, shooting the animals they could not take with them, and setting fire to the farmhouses that had been in their families for generations. They would rather see their homes reduced to ash than hand them over to the invaders. The city of Vyborg became a ghost town. The evacuation was chaotic, rushed, and freezing. But it was unanimous. Not a single civilian, save a handful of elderly who were too infirm to move, chose to live under Soviet rule. This mass, silent, and dignified act of defiance proved to the world who the victims were and who the aggressor was. Finland, as a nation, had survived. Its sovereignty was intact, but it was now in a desperate, precarious position. This period, known in Finnish history as the interim peace, was one of deep trauma and existential dread. The country was economically shattered. It had to absorb and house 420,000 refugees, a task that would have crippled a much larger nation. It was now diplomatically isolated. The Western allies, who had offered so much vocal support and so little material aid, were now busy with their own war, as Hitler turned his attention to France. The League of Nations was a joke, and the Soviet bear was still growling on its new, much closer, border. Marshal Mannerheim and the Finnish leadership knew with absolute certainty that this was not a peace, it was a ceasefire. Stalin, they believed, was merely waiting for a more opportune moment to finish the job. This desperation, this isolation, and this existential fear drove Finland into the arms of the only other power in Europe that also hated and feared Stalin, Nazi Germany. As 1940 progressed, quiet, pragmatic agreements for German trade, and later, for German troop transit, began. The bitter peace had set the stage, almost inevitably, for the continuation war in 1941, where Finland would find itself in a deeply uncomfortable co-belligerent alliance with Berlin, not out of ideological sympathy, but out of a desperate need for a protector against the Kremlin. On the Soviet side, Stalin's victory was unraveling before it was even a day old. He had his territory, but the price was internal panic and external humiliation. The Red Army immediately began a massive, panicked post-mortem, a series of internal reviews known as the Lessons of Finland. Reports flew to the Kremlin detailing the catastrophic failures in doctrine, equipment, and leadership. The purges, it was whispered, had been a mistake. The commissar system was a failure. The tanks were inadequate. The winter clothing was non-existent. This review triggered a massive, frantic, and ultimately incomplete reform of the Red Army. New tactics were implemented. The commissar's power was temporarily reduced, and the authority of professional officers was restored. They began a crash program to develop new, heavier tanks like the T-34 and KV-1, a direct response to the humiliation of seeing T-26 seconds destroyed by glass bottles. But all of this was done in a panic, and it was being watched. As discussed, Hitler saw the lessons of Finland not as a sign of Soviet strength and adaptability, but as a public confession of its weakness. The Red Army, in reforming, had shown the world exactly where it was broken. The term Phyrric victory is, in the end, an understatement. Stalin won a border. Finland, in losing, had won the world's respect. It had proven that it would fight, and fight with a skill and ferocity that shocked the globe. Simo Häyhä's 505 kills, the Motti tactics, and the Molotov Cocktail were not just stories, they were a data set, a warning to the Kremlin that to conquer Finland would cost more blood than the land was worth. The Finns had lost their second-largest city, but they had saved their nation. They had bought themselves just enough time and instilled just enough fear in their enemy to prepare for the next round. And everyone in Helsinki and Moscow knew it was coming. The Kremlin's lessons of Finland were not just about new tanks or the failures of the commissar system. In military academies and intelligence offices from Berlin to London, the Winter War was being analysed at the micro level. While the world's attention was on the grand, visible failures, the destroyed 44th Division, the burning T-26 seconds, the true professionals, the men who trained other men to fight, were studying the reports from Kollaa and Suomussalmi with a different, more focused intensity. They were looking at the tactics of the Finnish ski patrols. They were analysing the Motti concept. And, more than anything, they were studying the horrifying, lopsided kill ratios being produced by a single, unseen, and seemingly unkillable sniper. Before the Winter War, the concept of the sniper in most major armies was still a holdover from the First World War. He was a static, positional asset, a man in a trench with a heavy, long-range rifle, whose primary job was to harass the enemy and engage in duels with his opposite number. The Winter War, and Simo Häyhä's performance in particular, rendered this doctrine obsolete overnight. Häyhä had not been a static defender. He had been a mobile, aggressive, and invisible hunter. He was an artist of camouflage, fieldcraft, and psychological warfare. He proved that a single, highly skilled, and self-reliant individual could have a strategic impact, tying down entire divisions and shattering the morale of thousands. This new doctrine, the Winter War model, began to appear in military training manuals almost immediately. German Wehrmacht observers, who had been in Finland, sent back detailed reports that would directly influence the training of their own times, Scharfschützen**. The emphasis shifted from pure, long-distance marksmanship to what Häyhä had perfected, total environmental immersion. The new doctrine, which was a direct copy of the Finnish model, emphasized patience, the ability to remain motionless for hours in extreme conditions, the skill of building a perfect, invisible hide, and the initiative to operate alone, deep in enemy territory. Ironically, the nation that learned this lesson most thoroughly and most fatally was the Soviet Union. The Red Army had been the victim of the White Death. They had paid in blood 126,000 times over for their underestimation of the individual soldier. In the interim peace, and during the subsequent Great Patriotic War, the Soviet High Command, Stavka, set about creating, from scratch, the most robust, industrialized, and terrifyingly effective sniper program the world had ever seen. It was, in essence, the school of Häyhä. The Soviets embraced the doctrine of the sniper, not just as a support role, but as a core component of their infantry. They began mass-producing a more refined sniper rifle, the Mosin-Nagant with the PU scope, a more rugged and reliable system than the ones that had failed so badly in Finland. But more importantly, they focused on the times, human times element. They established dozens of sniper training schools, including the famous Central Women's Sniper Training School near Moscow, which alone produced over 1,800 female snipers. The legends of this new Soviet sniper corps figures like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Lady Death, with 309 confirmed kills, and Vasily Zaitsev, the hero of Stalingrad, were the direct doctrinal descendants of Simo Häyhä. The tactics Zaitsev used in the rubble of Stalingrad, his famous sixes technique, covering a large area with a team of 3 sniper observer pairs, his emphasis on patience, and his legendary duels, were all echoes of the lessons taught by Häyhä at Kollaa. The Red Army had, in a strange and violent paradox, industrialized the very Sisu that had humiliated them. They took the Finnish model of the individual hunter-killer and mass-produced it. And what of the man who had started it all? What of the ghost himself? Simo Häyhä's post-war life is perhaps the most profound part of his legacy. After awakening from his coma to the bells of the bitter peace, his war was over. He would endure years of agonizing recovery. His face, shattered by the explosive round, required 26 separate surgeries. His jaw was rebuilt using bone grafts from his hip. The man who emerged was not the same, quiet farmer. His face was permanently disfigured, his speech impaired. He had given his homeland his face. Yet, he refused to become a living propaganda tool. He was a national hero, promoted directly from corporal to second lieutenant by Marshal Mannerheim himself, an unprecedented field promotion. But he did not seek the spotlight. He did not write bombastic memoirs or go on speaking tours. The White Death wanted to be Simo Häyhä again. After his recovery, he did exactly what he had done before the war. He returned to his small, modest farm in Rautjärvi, in the small patch of Finland that was left. He became a successful farmer, a hunter, and a renowned dog breeder. He was, by all accounts, as laconic and humble as he had been before. He was a quiet, private man who was unfailingly polite to the journalists and historians who, inevitably, came to find the legend. They would arrive expecting a hardened warrior, a white death, and they would find a quiet, disfigured old man who wanted to talk about his hunting dogs. He rarely spoke of the war, and when he did, his answers were simple, direct, and devoid of any glory or malice. In one of his last interviews, late in his life, a reporter asked him the one question that had followed him for decades. Did he feel any remorse for killing over 500 men? Simo Häyhä, the farmer, the legend, the man who had changed the face of modern warfare, looked at the reporter and gave his simple, final answer. I only did what I was told to do, and what I could. He died in 2002, at the age of 96. His legacy is therefore a profound, twofold paradox. He was a humble patriot, a man who wanted only to farm his land, but who, when called upon, possessed the Sisu to single-handedly save his nation from collapse, embodying the Finnish spirit. And in doing so, he became the unwitting father of modern sniper doctrine, a man whose quiet, deadly expertise taught his enemies, through the most brutal experience imaginable, how to fight the very war he had so completely and terribly perfected. The Karelian Isthmus, March 1940, the silence is back. It is no longer the heavy, pregnant silence of November, the silence of a void waiting to be filled with violence. This is a new silence, an exhausted, wounded quiet. The ground, pulverized by millions of shells, is a pockmarked lunar landscape, black earth and splintered trees beneath the dirty, melting snow. The air no longer smells of cordite and diesel, it smells of wet wood and thaw. The artillery is silent, the cuckoo calls no more. This is the silence of the bitter peace, a silence of memory, of profound, stubborn loss, and of a survival that feels indistinguishable from grief. The Red Army's bombers are gone from the skies over Helsinki. The columns of tanks are no longer burning on the Rayat Road. The war is over. This was the campaign that was supposed to be a surgical, 3-week victory parade, a demonstration of Soviet industrial and ideological might that would see the Red Army marching through Helsinki by Stalin's 60th birthday. It was a war born of Stalin's paranoia and his hubris, a belief that an industrial colossus could simply, by weight alone, crush the will of a free people. It was a catastrophic, global humiliation, a cautionary tale of how industrial power, when wielded by an inflexible and unimaginative doctrine, means nothing against a people fighting for their very soul, their Sisu. The Red Army did not find a proletariat waiting to be liberated. It did not find a fascist government that would collapse at the first shot. What it found, lurking in the frozen white wastes, was a resilience personified by men like the quiet farmer turned sniper, Simo Häyhä. It found the Motti tactic, an intellectual, creative form of warfare that turned the Red Army's strength into its greatest weakness. It found the Molotov Cocktail, a people's weapon that proved individual courage, and a bottle of tar could defeat a 10-ton tank. It found, in short, that it was fighting an entire nation, a nation that would rather burn its own homes to the ground than see them occupied. The ultimate symbol of this entire conflict is not a tank, a banner, or a treaty. It is the man who became the White Death. The legend is a phantom, a ghost, a supernatural force who killed 505 men with iron sights. But the reality is the true lesson. The reality is Simo Häyhä, the man. He was a 5'3" farmer who loved to hunt, who was a champion marksman not because he loved to kill, but because he loved the precision of his craft. He did not go to war to become a legend. He went to war, as he said, because he was told to. His post-war life is the final, definitive proof of the Finnish Sisu. He did not become a politician. He did not grow rich from his fame. He endured 26 agonizing surgeries, his face permanently disfigured by the war's last random act of violence. And then he went home. He went back to farming, back to hunting, back to breeding his dogs. The White Death was a legend, But Simo Häyhä was a farmer who had a job to do. He did it, and when it was over, he went back to his life. His humble, quiet, and dignified existence was the final victory. He was a man who, when asked if he felt remorse, simply said, "I only did what I was told to do, and what I could." This quiet farmer, and the rifle he used, left an echo that would change the entire course of the Second World War. The bitter peace was a humiliation that the Kremlin could not hide. The Red Army's catastrophic incompetence, its hollow officer corps, and its poorly designed equipment had been laid bare for the entire world to see. And in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was watching. The data from the Winter War, the lopsided kill ratios, the destroyed tank columns, the psychological collapse was the final, critical piece of evidence he used to convince himself and his high command that the Soviet Union was a colossus on feet of clay. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, he did so with the supreme confidence, born from the Finnish snows, that the Red Army would collapse in 3 months. That catastrophic underestimation, that arrogant miscalculation, was the echo of Simo Häyhä's rifle. It was the legacy of the Motti, the Molotov Cocktail, and the 420,000 Finns who abandoned their homes. Finland's hopeless, desperate, and heroic stand, its ultimate act of Sisu, had not only saved its own sovereignty, it had baited the trap that would ultimately consume the Third Reich. The Red Army, having been bloodied, humiliated, and taught by the Finns, would reform itself, and on the bones of 27 million of its own citizens, it would, in the end, be the force to break the back of the Nazi war machine. But it was a lesson it had to learn, in the most brutal way imaginable, from a small nation of riflemen and the quiet farmer who became the ghost of Kollaa.